Well, Janet Yellen saying the U.S. needs to focus on other countries for trade in the Indo-Pacific rather than putting all the focus on China. Speaking at the Asia Society, the Treasury Secretary set the stage for U.S. China talks later this month between President Biden and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping.
At home, greater supply chain resilience provides stability for consumers and helps ensure that our country's economic security is not unduly reliant on just one country for many critical inputs. We're starting to see the impacts in the data. Across sectors, from auto parts to electronics, the U.S. is importing more from key partners like India and Vietnam, as well as from Mexico, and is less dependent on one single country, in this case, China.
Well, all of this comes as the two countries will carry out rare nuclear arm talks ahead of their meeting amid rising tensions between the two countries. Joining us now is Leland Miller, China Beige book co-founder, CEO. Leland, if in fact this meeting does happen between Chinese President Xi and President Biden, we're talking 2 weeks out in San Francisco. So the Chinese president traveling to the U.S. potentially, how significant would the stakes be in that?
Well, not terribly significant. There's something to be said for having talks to the U.S. and China because to some extent it puts a floor on the relationship. It prevents a greater collapse. But I think the overall directionality of this relationship is quite troubling. And so I think that more communication, that's great, but I don't think there's anything that this meeting will particularly accomplish other than just keeping the lines of communication. So that's a check mark, great, but nothing beyond that.
I mean, with that said, the Chinese president is traveling to the U.S., something we haven't seen in some time. The Chinese economy, there's still growth, but it is slowing growth. How much leverage do you think the White House believes it has in this case?
I don't think they have all that much leverage. If they did, they would be a lot tougher on export controls and other areas of the relationship. I think that what they're worried about right now is misinterpreting China or setting provocative signals to Xi Jinping and creating another mess in a global universe that is becoming troubling in Europe and in the Middle East and elsewhere. So what I think they're trying to do is crisis management right now. I don't think they're trying to accomplish anything in the U.S.-China relationship specifically.
With that said, let's talk specifically about what's been playing out in the Chinese economy. We were just showing sort of what we have seen stall out in terms of growth in China. There's a number of issues, obviously, within the property sector as well, but high jobless numbers among younger workers, too. I mean, where do you see the policy moving from here, given all the factors at play and the challenges President Xi faces?
Well, I think we're in the middle of a new norm. Markets are always bipolar on China. They either think great things are about to happen or they think that China's on the verge of collapse. Rarely are either of those true. So if you look at earlier in this year, investors were extremely bullish. They thought that coming out of the lockdowns from last year with COVID-0, that there was going to be explosive recovery and there was going to be explosive stock market rally. Neither of those happened. They were not realistic. But when those expectations were frustrated into the spring and into the summer, markets swung full circle the other way, and they decided that China was on the verge of collapse. That's also not true. You have what is essentially just a very poor recovery right now. You've got sequential growth most months in 2023. Everything except property is better than 2022. It's just not that great overall in terms of economy, and it should be much better. So it's really in the middle. Not a lot of good news, but also nothing catastrophic.
So what does that new norm look like? Are we talking about 5% growth roughly? And is that sort of something that we have seen Xi Jinping accept, that we're not talking about the 8% levels we saw several years ago? 5% is manageable growth, not stimulus at all costs.
Yeah, well, Beijing will hit 5% this year because the base of comparison is from a year that was a total disaster. But 5% going forward is a total pipe dream. I think we're going to be talking about levels that are much closer to 2% in the future, not necessarily in the next 2 years. But this is an economy that's going to be growing much, much more slowly. And I think the mistake that investors have been making for several years now is they've gotten very bearish cyclically. They were too bearish over the summer, but they're not bearish enough structurally. So they should be more bullish cyclically, but they should be more bearish structurally. China's going to be slowing down 5%, 4%, 3%. We're going to be seeing much, much slower growth than that going forward.
What does that mean ultimately for U.S. businesses, multinational businesses that have set up operations in China for many, many years? The potential growth there has been the big lure to China. Does that money continue to flow through, even in a 5%, 4% economy?
Yeah, some of it will, but what it really means is you have to know your market. This idea 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that you just put your operations in China, and because there were 1.4 billion Chinese, they'll buy a lot of stuff. That didn't work, and it's not going to work going forward. What you have to understand is the way the economy is working. What does the government look for in terms of favored sectors or disfavored sectors? You know, where are Chinese consumers going to be spending in the future? They're certainly going to want more babies. They certainly have a lot of old people to take care of. So there's a lot of opportunities that are still inside the Chinese marketplace. They're not necessarily the ones that people thought were going to be the big hitters a few years ago. And the idea of just going into China, investing there, and then you see a profit a few years later, that dream is gone.
China Beige Book's Leland Miller, always good to get your insights. Appreciate the time today.
Thank you.